Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we are going to get into chapter 2 of the psychology book, and this one is my favorite chapter. It's the biology of the mind, aka the introduction to neuroscience. So, as I said in my introduction and in my video, I am a self-proclaimed neuro nerd. The idea of when I went through Psych 1 myself, I thought it was interesting, and I thought some chapters were a little more interesting than others. And when I got to the equivalent of Psych 2, which is basically the whole class about this chapter, it blew my mind. And that's when I decided I definitely made the right choice being a psych major, and that I wanted to dedicate my life to studying the most amazing thing in this universe, which is the human brain. We still have so much research to be done on it. We learned so much over this last, 120 years or so, 130 years, but there's still so much that's left to discover. And some of the things will just blow your mind, like they did mine. Maybe not everybody, but I think some of you will really enjoy getting to know about the brain. So again, like the last chapter, it's in 3 parts: neural and hormonal systems, tools of discovery and older brain structures, and then the cerebral cortex and our structure and function of our brains. So I will go in the first half or first portion of this, excuse me, of this chapter into neural and hormonal systems, and then I will take the last 2, tools of discovery, older brain structures, and the newer structures built on top of the old, and I'll use that as the second part of the lecture. And after the second part, when I will be going over all of the parts of the brain and the lobes, that is to be used to help answer your questions for the worksheet. That is the second homework assignment. So I hope you had a good first week with the class and are getting used to the online format, and let us continue with neuroscience. So one thing that I always love pointing out is that every single thing that we do, every reflex, every movement, every urge, every emotion, every thought we have, every word we say, every little or big thing we do starts and ends with the human brain. Information from our 5 senses, as we'll talk about in chapter 6, that's why I skipped from chapter 2 to chapter 6, which will be next. Every one of our 5 senses comes up and goes to the brain, and the brain has to interpret it. And we don't understand those things that we see, hear, touch, taste, or feel without the brain interpreting that information and giving us something to understand. Every movement we make, the brain has to tell the muscles what to do and how to do it. So everything that we do, everything psychological, every idea, every mood, every urge, everything we do is biological and starts with the brain. The brain is in charge of every single thing, and I intend to show you this throughout this chapter. So psychologists like myself that work from a biological perspective look at the links between biology and behavior. I looked at some of the genetics involved in schizophrenia when I was at UCLA, and I got to look at mouse behavior on memory type tasks in the presence and absence of a gene that has to do with memory and learning and thinking. So it was very interesting for me. We look at the links between our biology and how we behave. So again, this is why in the nature-nurture discussion that I said I was 20% nature, 80% nature and 20% nurture, as opposed to some other configuration, because I studied the brain and biological mechanisms and genetics, and I am fairly convinced, based on a lot of the evidence that I discovered on my own and from what I read in books and was taught before that, that it really starts with majority is what you're born with, and that you can make choices based on your environment and growing up, but the things you gravitate towards in general tend to come from your genetics. So as we discussed in the prologue, humans are on the three axes, the biopsychosocial. We are biopsychosocial systems in which our biological, psychological, and social cultural factors interact to influence how we act, if we have any disorders, our thought processes, all of that. Today, of course, we are concentrating on that biological side. So, even though we made our own attempts to answer the nature-nurture questions to the best of our abilities, it was that first question that we talked about that Plato asked in the prologue. And the biggest debate of all time in philosophy that carried over to psychology is what is known as the mind-brain problem. So again, there were two schools of thought. One is that the brain and the body were made of the same material and was a fluid process where they were one. The brain basically was in charge of the body, and that's what we find today. So people like Plato said the mind is located in the spherical head. Aristotle said, no, the mind is in the heart. And of course, it's nice to hear that, right? Some people think with their heart, some people think with their brain. If you're more logical, they say you think with your brain. If you're more sentimental, they say you think with your heart. But the general consensus nowadays, as I said, is that the brain and the body are one and the same, and that the mind itself is just a construct. It's just an idea. And that even though we do have abstract ideas and thoughts, it doesn't come from somewhere in the atmosphere or the universe. It seems to come from our own head, from our own brain. And back in the time of Freud and William James, there was a man named Franz Gall. Maybe it was, about the turn of the century in 1900, that Franz Gall had an idea that turned out to be not quite right, but sort of set the tone with where we are today. Franz Gall started something called phrenology. And if you've never heard of phrenology, which I will give you guys a video for that, phrenology showed that, or it was supposed to reveal people's mental abilities and character traits. So if we think back to the prologue and we think about Titchener, remember I talked about Titchener being Wilhelm Wundt's first student, and Titchener was trying to build a structure of the mind, right? He called it structuralism, from people's introspection, from their stories and their interpretations of things that he showed them. Well, Gall went the other direction. So Gall gave us what we call a wrong-headed theory. So what phrenology was basically reading the bumps on your skull. And he believed that the bumps on your skull, wherever they were more pronounced, right, meant that the brain right underneath the skull was pushing up on the skull, and that part of the brain was more developed or stronger than the other parts of the brain. And if you had a little indentation or divot in your skull, that was a very immature or not very developed part of the brain. So as you can see here in the picture on the left, we have morality, we have reflectiveness, perceiving, aspiring, so wanting, longing, right? Here is domesticating. Animal instincts are over here above the ear, right? And so what he believed was that these different specific parts of the brain had to do with parts of your personality, and whichever ones were raised on your skull, those would be the ones that you would have more developed. So what we find now, 100+ years later, is that The different parts of the brain, as you see on the right-hand side, are very specific for very specific functions. So that's the part that Gall got right. But we call it a wrong-headed theory because, first of all, your bumps on the skull don't tell us anything, because there's actually a layer of liquid called cerebrospinal fluid that actually is between the skull and the brain. So the brain would never be pushing up against the skull anyway. It's sort of a protective fluid that keeps from the brain hitting against the skull because, and if you didn't know this, now you know, when the brain actually hits up against the skull, that's what we call a concussion, because it goes through the watery substance, the fluid, and actually hits against the skull, which is very dangerous because the brain is pretty fragile, and it is, your central computer. So bumps on the skull tell us nothing about the brain's underlying functions, but the assumptions that different parts of the brain had very specific function turned out to absolutely be true. They're not the functions that Gall proposed, but the different parts of the brain do control different aspects of behavior. So here, where we saw perceptiveness, this is actually what's known as the prefrontal cortex. There is speech, emotions, thinking and judgment and planning here. Underneath is the sense of taste and smell. Here in the back, we see vision. Here, above the ear, is where we actually perceive sound, spatial awareness, movement, right? All of these things. So it's very specific to things that we process with the brain, but not to our personality, as Gall once proposed. So it's a wrong-headed theory. He got the idea of what we call localization, that specific parts of the brains have very specific function. He just got that function wrong. And it was back in the day, so we didn't have the tools to know what we know now. When we're looking at the past century plus, researchers have done a lot of information, a lot of researching on the brain to figure out exactly how it works. And at the basis of it, the main building block of the brain is what are called brain cells or neurons. Sometimes they're called nerve cells. So these nerve cells seem to run on our own, somehow, electrical activity within the body. They conduct electricity, and that was what was discovered as far back as the 1700s. And it really was thought that our brain was kind of like an electrical circuit that was connected, and that when we had a thought or when we had an urge or had to move, the brain would turn on the circuit and we would just let the electricity do its thing, like turning on a light switch. But it was about 100 or so years ago that researchers discovered under a microscope that the neurons were actually not connected, and that there were little gaps in them, which they call a synapse. There was a little gap between the sending and receiving cells, and so they realized that it was not the electrical activity that basically made everything happen. What the electrical activity did was it opened the gates, like opening a garage door, and these little chemicals we call neurotransmitters went across the tiny little gap, swam across, and bound, connected with the next cell, and that caused more activity. So even though the main part for years was thought to all be electricity, the electricity actually has to happen and activate in order for the chemicals that we talk about in the brain to be able to go from one place to another and give the signals out from the brain to the rest of the body. So what we know is that specific brain systems serve specific functions. So there are circuits, they're just not connected, and they do certain things. And that information is integrated to construct a very big, wide range of experiences. That's why you get better at practicing instruments or sports or dancing or things like that. As you get better, the brain is wired by experience. So it takes into account that you've done it, repetitions, getting the muscles together, something we call muscle memory sometimes. And that as we practice and as we do things more and more, we get better at them. Our brain becomes better. we're better coordinated, right? Things like that. And it's the brain that puts it all together. The adaptive brain is wired by experience. So here's the big picture, and I'm not going to go fast. I'm going to go kind of slow so that you can hopefully absorb the information. Our brain is made up of billions and billions of these elementary building blocks of the brain, which are called, again, neurons. Neurons are the elementary components of the nervous system. We call them the body's speedy electrochemical system. The electricity is needed to open the gates, and once the gates are open, they release the chemicals. We are going to go not too into detail about how this happens, but I am going to give you the big picture so that you are aware. Normally on ground class, we would go over this in 3 lectures so that I went over this part more than once, but because it's recorded, you can just play it back a couple times if you want to. So the neurons are our building blocks. Our brain and our nervous system is made up of billions and billions of these neurons that connect to each other and connect to things like muscles and glands and all of those things. The neuron has 3 parts to it, which we're going to get to on the next page. It sends its signals down this thing called an axon, which ends in these little things called axon terminals, or sometimes they're called terminal buttons because, as you'll see on the next slide, they look like little buttons. That's where the chemicals are kept. When they send that information, the electrical signal goes down through this axon. On the other end, there is a cell body called the soma. Soma is Greek for body, and that contains the life of the cell. That contains all the DNA, and it contains what we call the nucleus of the cell, all of the life force of that cell. And sticking out of that end, out of the cell body, are these little tree branch-like portions or extensions that are called dendrites. That electrical signal down the axon, and then that can cause the gates to open, and that cell will release chemicals to the next cell or the next muscle or the next brain structure. So axons are very important because they carry that electrical signal, which means that if we are to communicate with over 100 billion neurons, that they need to be really effective and the communication needs to be really fast. So most axons, I know it says some, I've been meaning to change that to most. Most axons are actually encased in a white fatty tissue called a myelin sheath. You know, sheath like what a sword goes into when it's in a holster. And this myelin sheath is basically made up of fatty tissue that goes around the axon, kind of like a telephone, you know, or a plastic coating goes over your telephone cord or your charger for your cell phone. And what that does is it does 2 things. One, it is a conductor, so it makes the electrical signal go even faster, over 100 times its normal speed. And if you have a bare wire, right? First of all, that can electrocute you if you touch it, but nobody's touching axons, of course. But one of the things that we need is for the information to go as fast as possible in the right direction. When we have a cell phone charge, we need the electrical activity to go from the part that's plugged in into the cable that charges the phone. If somehow the wire wasn't protected or coated, that electrical signal could go backwards, it could go out the sides, and you wouldn't get much of a charge, or it would well, there are helper cells that we call glial cells. And glial cells do basically everything to keep the neuron healthy and to keep it viable and to keep it alive. So glial cells actually make up about 90% of the brain. The other 10% is the actual neurons. Glial cells provide myelin, so they make the myelin on the axons. They support, nourish, and protect the neurons. So basically, if I ask you a question about glial cells, they do all of the above. They give energy to neurons. They eat away in the bad stuff and nurse them back to health. They even help to protect the chemicals that are around so that the other cells can pick them up. And they detect any danger and try to help out. They also play a role in thinking and learning in the brain. So getting back to the big picture, we have many different branching dendrites that can pick up many different signals. Some of them are going to give positive electrical activity, some of them negative electrical activity. When the combined signal, if it goes up in electrical activity enough, there is a line called a threshold. And if this signal goes up above the threshold, the neuron will fire that electrical signal down the cell and cause the chemical to release at the end. This is what's called an action potential. And as you see at the top here, the neuron's reaction is an all or none process. So think about an imaginary line about a few millivolts higher than where it normally is. And if that line gets passed, then you have an action potential. An all or none process means every single time it reaches that line, whether it just barely goes over the line or if it goes way over the line, that signal, that cell will release the electrical signal and you will get a chemical to be released. So it's an all or none process. If this electrical activity does not reach that threshold, even if it's just below the line, the cell will not fire. So that's why we call it an all or none process. If it crosses the threshold, the cell will fire 100% of the time without fail. If it does not cross the threshold, the cell will not fire at all, 0% of the time. Therefore, this action potential is called an all or none process. So here is what the neuron looks like. And again, there are three main parts here. We have the cell body in the middle that contains the nucleus or the cell's life support center. Branching away, and I should probably point this out, that when we see the brain and when we talk about the parts of the brain, most of them were named for given Latin names, and most of them were named for what they look like. There are a few exceptions to that rule where they're basically named for where they're located, and we'll get to that later in this chapter. But most of the things are named for what they look like. In this case, the cell body is known as the soma. Soma is actually a Greek word, not a Latin word, that means body. So the cell body is the life of the cell. Sticking out, you can see these things that under a microscope look like little tree branches. These are what are known as the dendrites. And dendrites are the ones that receive the messages from other cells. So other cells can line up around this one and release their chemicals. The chemicals are picked up by these little receptors on the dendrites. And basically the chemical binds to the receptor like a lock and a key. The chemical is the key, and the dendrite receptor is the lock. And if the key goes into the lock, if it fits, then you get some sort of electrical activity as a result. So as I said, some are positive, some are negative, but if you get enough positive flow, enough positive voltage, then it reaches the threshold or beyond, and it causes this action potential to go down the long part of the neuron, which is called the axon. So here we see, and in the artist rendering, they've taken away a few layers of this myelin sheath to show you the axon is the long part of the neuron. Now, some of these axons can be pretty short. Some of these axons can be super long. There's actually an axon or a neuron that goes from your spinal cord all the way down to your little toe. And for it to reach there, that axon has to be really long, which means that action potential has to send that signal a long, long way, right? Think about a giraffe from its brain to its legs with that long neck. So some of these neurons, you need to make sure that there is enough electrical activity so that it gets to the endpoint. So here's the axon, and the electrical signal starts here from the cell body, goes down the axon, and then ends up in these little terminal branches or axon terminals, and that's again where the chemicals are kept. So that signal has to be just as strong here at the end as it was at the beginning. That's why we have this myelin. What myelin does, again, is it allows the electrical signal not only to go faster down the axon, but basically it allows it to be able to recharge itself at every little step along the way. Unlike your phone cord for your charger, which is completely covered in plastic, the axon, or the myelin sheath on the axon, is actually more like hot dog links because it leaves these tiny little spots of bare axon. And what that does is that allows the electrical impulse to basically recharge itself at every little bare spot along the axon. So if you have the signal that starts here, it's going really fast in this direction, and then it recharges itself, and then goes fast, recharges itself, then fast. Then by the time it reaches here, the end, the signal is just as strong as it was at the beginning, and we can ensure that these terminals, right, or terminal branches, will release the chemicals, right? So again, signal is picked up by the dendrites, like a lock and a key. That chemical binds to the dendrite receptors. That causes electrical activity to charge up. If we get enough positive electrical activity, it reaches the threshold. That is an all or none process. Then that causes the electrical signal to go down the axon and sort of recharge itself along the way. And that way it ensures to be just as strong at the end as it was at the beginning. That opens the gates and allows more chemicals to go to the next cell or to the next muscle or to the next brain structure. So the action potential is that neural impulse that travels down the axon like a wave. Here at the very beginning, we can see that this little node or this little bare spot of the axon is blown up. And what we see is the same electrical activity that started here at the cell body is going to stimulate down the axon. This causes a brief change in electrical charge. If it's strong enough, and we know it's already strong enough because it started going down the axon, this produces what we call a depolarization, which just means an increase in voltage and electrical activity. And if it reaches the threshold, it is an action potential. Once the action potential reaches that spot, the bare spot along the axon, it produces another little action potential. So basically it recharges that electrical impulse and allows it to go farther down the axon to the next one and the next one. And as the action potential continues down the axon, the first section has now recharged and is ready to take more action potentials. Because, spoiler alert, the way that the brain understands, since the action potential, all or none, is one size, it's not the strength of an action potential that allows us to understand between a dull light and a bright light, or a quiet sound and a really loud sound. It's the number of action potentials. The more action potentials that come down quickly, the louder or brighter or more smelly the smell is, right? So that's how our brain determines the difference in colors, the difference in strength, speed, sound, right? Things like that. So again, looking at the big picture, the neuron receives signals from other neurons. Some are telling it to fire, meaning positive voltage. Some are telling it not to fire. Some give negative voltage. If we have too much electrical activity in our system, that's not good either, because that can cause a lot of problems. We'll get to that. So if it is enough to reach that threshold, again, it's an all or none process. So if the threshold is reached, if there's enough electrical activity, the action potential starts moving down the axon. Again, the action potential either fires if it hits the threshold or anywhere above it, or it doesn't fire if it's just below the threshold or anywhere below the threshold. More stimulation does nothing. This action potential is the same no matter how strong it is, whether it barely reaches the threshold or whether it pushes way above the threshold, the action potential is always the same size. Once the action potential has started, as we've already seen, it travels down the axon from the cell body to the terminal branches, and at each little bare spot along the way, it recharges itself to ensure that it's just as strong at the end as it was at the beginning. So once it reaches those terminal branches at the end, it basically opens the garage door or opens the gate, and the cell releases more chemicals to the next cells or to the structure of the brain or to the muscles. The signal is transmitted to other cells, but again must find a way to swim or cross this little gap between the cells. So that's basically how the action potential works and how neural communication works. So what is it that these chemicals are? What are these chemicals and how do they help us to do everything that we do? Well, we have very specific neurotransmitters that travel in a very specific pathway and may influence very specific behaviors and or emotions. Four main neurotransmitters that are specific that I'm going to talk about, and then I will talk about two very general, sort of what we call global, or what I call global neurotransmitters that affect every part of the brain. So one of these, for example, is called acetylcholine, and it's abbreviated with ACH. Acetylcholine is actually the chemical that goes from the brain down to the muscles to tell them what to do. Acetylcholine, so it affects muscle action. Any movement we make, we send acetylcholine to the muscles to tell them which way to go. If a dodgeball is coming at my face because I'm playing dodgeball, my brain sees it, interprets it, and says, I better duck or get out of the way. So my brain is going to send acetylcholine down to my legs, and hopefully it allows me to duck or move to the left or right and not get hit in the face with a dodgeball. Inside the brain, acetylcholine is also involved in learning and memory, and those are the neurons that start to die off in a disease or disorder that we call Alzheimer's. So those are, if you ever wondered why people with Alzheimer's, whether in the movies or if you know somebody in real life, why they start to lose their memory and they don't remember who people are or things like that, and it's really hard for them to learn new things, it's because the acetylcholine neurons are the ones that are being basically destroyed in the brain. In addition to the neurotransmitters, we also have other chemicals that we call sometimes neurohormones or neuropeptides that do other things for our body that are still controlled by the brain. So I'm still fulfilling my promise to tell you and show you that everything we do starts and ends with the brain. So if you've ever gotten hurt, sprained an ankle, or something like that, you may notice that the pain sucks, especially for the first couple minutes, and then it kind of subsides a little bit. Not a lot, depending on how bad the injury is, but it's still, enough to take the edge off. And that is what we call endorphins. Endorphins are natural opiates or painkillers that are made in our brain and released by our brain in response to either pain, like spraining an ankle, excessive exercise. So if you've ever heard the term runner's high, somebody that runs a long distance at the end may claim that they feel this kind of euphoric happiness, almost like they've ingested some sort of drug. And that is a ramping up of endorphins based on the excessive exercise that you're doing by running a long distance. Of course, endorphins are also released in response to sex with an orgasm. So when we talk about drugs, speaking of which, drugs, by the way, a drug is just anything that causes the chemicals in your brain to react, that's not made by the brain or the body. So anything that you take from outside the body that causes these chemicals to alter um, or affect their brain chemistry at the synapses. That's what a drug is. So medication is a drug, marijuana is a drug, anything that you're prescribed or anything you buy on the street. Those are all drugs. Anything that is not made by the body but affects the way that the body and brain produce neurotransmitters and things like that is called a drug. So drugs can have one of two effects on the brain. They can either cause more of a chemical to be released or picked up, which is called an agonist, or they can cause less of a neurotransmitter to be released or taken up by the next cells, and that's called an antagonist, like the bad guy in a movie or play. So an agonist is defined as any molecule, drug molecule, right, that increases a neurotransmitter's action. So an agonist can cause more chemical to be released in the axon terminal, or it can cause more chemical to be picked up by the next cell on the dendrites, or it can actually cause more of the neurotransmitter if our brain produces more neurotransmitter than we need. So it's another failsafe, kind of like having myelin on the axons. And a lot of times, just in case, we produce more chemicals than is needed or that can be picked up in the synapse. So they're either recycled, or we call this reuptake, down the chemical and cause, when the receptors are ready, to take up more. So that's another way an agonist can work. That's actually how a antidepressant called SSRIs work. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So reuptake is that process of recycling the leftover chemical back into its original packaging, back into its original terminal. Um, so what drugs like Prozac, which is an SSRI, prevents the reuptake. So basically it leaves the chemicals in the gap in the synapse, and when the next cell is ready, when it's reset, it can take up the rest of that serotonin. Low serotonin, if you didn't know, is one of the biological signs of depression. We will talk about that in the last chapter. Um, and so this is how an SSRI works. Bet you didn't think you'd get that type of lesson from chapter 2. Don't worry, that won't be on the exam. An antagonist, on the other hand, causes either less release of a neurotransmitter, or more than likely it partially or fully blocks the receptor, kind of like sticking a gum in your lock for your house so that the key can't fit in there. So basically it either partially or fully blocks that neurotransmitter's action, and as a result you have less neurotransmitter that's being released. In schizophrenia, that which we'll talk about again in the last chapter, one of the problems that causes the psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, things like that, is too much dopamine in the brain, in an area of the brain called the basal ganglia. You don't have to worry about what a basal ganglia is, don't worry. And so what some of this medication does is it's a dopamine antagonist and causes less dopamine to be picked up in that part of the brain, and therefore controls some of those psychotic symptoms. So you have an agonist and an antagonist. So looking at, as I said, there's about 4 specific neurotransmitters. Looking at the picture on the left, you can see that serotonin goes all through the brainstem and up, and is kind of widespread in the cortex at the top, and also goes back and connects to a part of the brain called the cerebellum. which is right here underneath the big cortex. Dopamine also starts in the middle of the brain, kind of goes down a little bit in the brainstem, but most of its work is right here in the near the frontal lobe, and some of these brain structures in the middle that have to do with emotions and addiction. So serotonin has a different pathway than dopamine, and that has a different pathway than acetylcholine and some of these other ones. So you can see that the chemical messengers have very specific pathways. These are some of the specific neurotransmitters. Now, here's again one of those tables that's sort of yellowish, orangish, pinkish, whatever. That is a really good study tool when you're looking at these things. So here are the 4 main specific neurotransmitters, and at the bottom we have the 2 global neurotransmitters, I call them. They're more like peptides. So acetylcholine, as we talked about first, is the one that enables muscle action. So it's the one that connects outside of the brain and spinal cord and goes to the muscles to tell them what to do. All of the, your skeletal muscles. So it enables action at the muscles. We call that the acetylcholine neurons that seem to deteriorate and die off. And that's why with Alzheimer's, it's a specific type of dementia that people have trouble remembering, learning new things, and things like that. Dopamine is probably my favorite of the neurotransmitters. It has a whole, mess of things that it does. It influences movement. So it is the main culprit. Dopamine neurons are being destroyed in people that have Parkinson's disease, like Michael J. Fox. It influences learning, attention, and emotions. And in fact, what we see here is, again, too much dopamine is linked to schizophrenia. Too little dopamine is linked to the movement problems like tremors and loss of motor control that we see in Parkinson's disease. And spoiler alert, and we'll get back to this in chapter 3 after chapter 6. We'll come back to chapter 3. Dopamine is also the main culprit in what we call the addiction pathway. So if you are addicted to drugs or alcohol, if you're addicted to sex or gambling or food or anything that you can be addicted to, gaming, the internet, shopping, whatever it is, you can't stop yourself from doing it. It's because dopamine is flowing into the brain and not just telling our brain that we like it, it's telling our brain affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. Um, Although melatonin is probably something that you guys have heard of, we'll talk about that in chapter 3 in the sleep portion of the chapter, that helps you to get to sleep. Serotonin also calms the body down and gets it ready um, for bed as well. So an undersupply of serotonin is also the main culprit that we talk about in depression from a biological standpoint. So again, those SSRIs, drugs that raise serotonin levels specifically, are used to treat depression. It's not just serotonin levels that are low. Arousal levels, based on the next one called norepinephrine, are also pretty low. And the original drugs that were antidepressants targeted both norepinephrine and serotonin. But when you are targeting more than one neurotransmitter system, the problem is there's more of a chance of side effects happening. So the nice thing about serotonin is that it seems to be the ringleader, and that if you get serotonin to balance out, it brings norepinephrine and sometimes to a degree dopamine with it. We don't try to give dopamine agonists to patients that are depressed. Sigmund Freud actually tried that. One of the biggest dopamine agonists is called cocaine. And, that didn't really work out so well for Freud's patients. So we don't necessarily think things like cocaine or methamphetamines, right? Meth um, is probably the best idea to treat things like that. So thank goodness for serotonin, because when serotonin regulates, it seems to bring norepinephrine and dopamine to a degree with it. So going back to that, norepinephrine is controlling alertness and arousal levels of the body. So higher levels of norepinephrine, you're going to have much more arousal level. Too much norepinephrine is not a good idea, because how are you going to get to sleep? It can cause a lot of problems. But the undersupply of it, if you don't have enough, is linked to mood disorders like depression. So those are the four main neurotransmitters, the specific ones that have specific pathways and do specific things. The other two neurotransmitters are GABA and glutamate, and those are the ones that are basically everywhere in the brain. That's why I call them global neurotransmitters. GABA, which stands for which is the abbreviation of gamma aminobutyric acid. Yeah, so it's much easier just to say GABA, is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter. So that one, when it's released, is going to cause cells to go down in voltage and make them less likely to fire. Why would we want to do something like that? Well, much like temperature, our body temperature being at 98.6 degrees in a nice zone that's not too high because that'll cause a fever, or too low, which will cause hypothermia, our brain likes to have a good amount of electrical activity, but not too much. Too much activity could cause problems. Too much electrical activity can cause anxiety. It can cause insomnia, the inability to sleep. It can even cause seizures. If you've ever seen anybody that's had a seizure, it almost looks like they're being electrocuted, like they're being shocked. And in a way, it's true, because your brain has too much electrical activity and it's causing your body to shake and seize the way that it does. So that's too much activity. And too much activity may come from too much glutamate. So glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter. It's involved in learning and memory, and again, keeping us invested in things. But too much, right? It's involved in memory, it's involved in learning. Too much, just like too little GABA, can cause too much stimulation in the brain. So that can cause migraines, seizures, and the things above. So why do we see a box that says the undersupply of GABA and the oversupply of glutamate can cause this to happen? Well, GABA and glutamate are kind of like a scale. When one goes up, the other goes down. You can think of it as a negative correlation, right? Or you can think of it like yin and yang. The more of one, the less of the other. So more GABA equals less glutamate. More glutamate equals less GABA. They work in succession with each other to try to maintain a good level of activity in the brain without getting too crazy. And if we need to calm down, as we'll talk about in chapter 3, anti-anxiety type of drugs settle down and cause more GABA to be given, or by default, less glutamate. If we are tired and need more, caffeine and things like that can usually boost glutamate indirectly and cause GABA to be lower. So that's why we see this. In coming across these things, we don't really talk about them much like we did back in my day. And now that makes me sound really old. I'm not even 42 yet. But in this case, people used to love going to get Chinese food, especially in the 80s and 90s. A lot of these chains, Panda Express and things like that. And people really loved the flavor of some of the food because they used a flavor enhancer called MSG, which actually stands for monosodium glutamate. And that means what you think it means, that they were getting more glutamate in their brain after eating this food. But a lot of people complained of getting migraines. Some people had seizures, and they realized that it was due to an increase in electrical activity in the brain caused by this monosodium glutamate, or MSG. So now most Chinese food or Asian food places do not use MSG as a flavor enhancer because of the not fun side effects. So really quickly, before we go, I wanted to talk about the breakdown of the neural systems, and then talk about another system of chemicals that doesn't have anything to do with electricity and neurotransmitters. So the nervous system is basically our connection in and out, inside and outside the brain, of these neurons that go to every muscle and to the glands and organs and things like that to let them know what's going on. So the nervous system is this whole network of neurons, and it's broken down into two main systems. It's the body's speedy electrochemical communication network that consists of all of these neurons or nerve cells of the central and peripheral nervous systems. So the central nervous system is pretty easy. It's the main computer system. The central nervous system is only two structures, the brain and the spinal cord, which is connected to the brain down below. From the spinal cord, that's where information goes to and from the body. So the brain and spinal cord are the body's decision maker. Anytime I refer to the central, or the book refers to the central nervous system, it's just those two, the brain and the spinal cord. The other system, which goes outside of the brain and spine, is basically everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. It's on the periphery, on the edges, right? That's why we call it the peripheral nervous system. But the peripheral nervous system is made up of two other systems. There are sensory and motor neurons. There's actually three types of neurons, which we're about to talk about. But sensory neurons, if the word sensory sounds like the five senses, that's because those are the neurons that carry information from our five senses up to the brain to be interpreted. And motor neurons are exactly what you'd think motor neurons are. Those are the neurons that go down to the muscles to enable us to move and be a motor system. So they connect the central nervous system with the rest of the body, which is what we call the peripheral nervous system. So this peripheral nervous system is further broken down into two more systems called the somatic nervous system, which is all of those sensory and motor neurons, and the autonomic nervous system. So let me get to those as we go through. The somatic nervous system is those sensory neurons that go up to the brain about that carry information about our outside world through everything we see, touch, taste, smell, and hear. And of course, the motor neurons are leaving the brain and spinal cord and going to the actual muscles to tell them what to do. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, is our body's system that's activated in response to any threats or any danger, for us to either have the means to stay and fight, or, like we talked about in the prologue with this whole survival of the fittest, if we know that we're outmatched, we may need to use that fear to run away and stay alive and live another day or another 50 years or so. So the autonomic nervous system is that system that arouses the rest of our body and allows us to either stay and fight or run away. And the autonomic nervous system, again, is split into two more divisions. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which arouses and expends energy and enables more control of our skeletal voluntary muscles. So whether we need to stay and fight, or whether we need our muscles to coordinate so that we can run away from danger, this sympathetic nervous system ramps up our energy and ramps up our control of our muscles so that we can either stay and fight or run away. So as you see on the left side here, we have the pupils will dilate so that we can see a little more. heartbeat and respiration, breathing and heartbeat speed up. The stomach stops digesting because digestion takes up energy. So if we stop digesting, this allows us to divert more energy to our body. The pancreas and liver are going to stimulate glucose, which is a spike in our blood sugar. The adrenal glands are going to stimulate and cause the release of adrenaline, which of course is going to help us to speed up our system. Sometimes our sex hormones are also going to be activated during this time. So what this does is allows us more control over our muscles, our lungs, our heart, our eyes, to be able to stay and fight or run away. So this sympathetic subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, I like to call the fight or flight system. It ramps up, conserves energy, gives more control of the muscles so we can either stay and fight or run away. Ramps up our system by giving us adrenaline, increasing our heartbeat, dilating our pupils and things like that. But of course, if we were to stay in this sympathetic state of arousal, eventually that wouldn't be good for our body. So at some point, we need to ramp ourselves back down and get back down to normal. Just like glutamate and GABA are allowing us to maintain a, not too much, not too little level of energy in our brain, our body needs to calm back down. So the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that undoes everything the sympathetic nervous system does. It stimulates digestion, it slows our heartbeat and respiration, it tells the adrenaline to shut off, and it brings us back down and calms us back to our normal resting state. So if the sympathetic division I called the fight or flight system, here, because we start digestion up again and we're calming our system down, I call the parasympathetic subdivision the rest and digest system. So the autonomic nervous system is made up of the sympathetic fight or flight system to get us going, and the parasympathetic calms us down and conserves our energy, and so I call it the rest and digest system. As I just mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 3 types of neurons in our nervous system. We have the sensory neuron, which goes up to our brain from the body, that brings information about our 5 senses from our outside world to the brain to interpret what's going on. So sensory neurons carry messages from the body's tissues and sensory receptors inward up to our spinal cord and up to our brain to process what's going on in our world. Once we figure that out, so again, if we're playing, again, I go back to my dodgeball example, the sensory neuron will allow me to see the ball getting closer to my face and to my brain to interpret that something is about to hit me in the face. Then my brain makes the decision to send motor information from motor neurons back down from the central nervous system out to the muscles to tell me to duck so I don't get hit in the face with a dodgeball. In between the motor and sensory systems, we have a 3rd type of neuron, which is within the central nervous system itself, called the interneuron. The interneurons communicate with one another and process information between sensory input and motor output. So if I were to ask you guys, and I know this is all rhetorical because this is a recording, which of these 3 types of neurons do you think we have the most of in our nervous system? And if you didn't know, which you probably don't, but that's okay because I'm about to tell you, it is this one, the interneuron. So the interneurons within the brain and spinal cord connect to other neurons. They connect neuron to neuron, help to regulate the sensory and motor systems that are going up and down to and from the brain. So interneurons are the most numerous in our nervous system. In the book, it talks about the adult brain having about 86 billion neurons. That was from a paper by Azevedo in 2009. In a more updated version, that's why I use the nice round number of 100 billion plus. So we've actually realized in the last 10 or so years that there's actually over 100 billion neurons in most adult brains. And even though our brain accounts for only 2% of our body weight, it is our central computer and accounts for 20% of our energy output. That's 1/5 of our entire energy output. When we talk about these neurons, right, I told you guys already that they form circuits with other parts of the brain and other systems. And that's what allows our memories to work the way they do, our language acquisition, right, and all of those things. Our neural networks and pathways govern reflexes, movements, urges. Remember, every single little or big thing that we do is the brain is in charge of it. So it's a highly efficient electrochemical information system with lots of action potentials, lots of electrical activity, lots of chemicals going back and forth through the brain to the body and back. It is responsible for every single thing that we do. So just to review, our central nervous system is just the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system, which is split up into sensory neurons going up, bringing information to the brain, motor neurons coming back down to the body and giving us a response to what our five senses are telling us. And the autonomic nervous system, which has the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic nervous system to bring us back down to normal. I call that the rest and digest system. Now, I'm sure you're sitting here going, Dr. B, why don't you just give us a nice flow chart to show us all this information? Well, your wish is my command, and here is our nervous system. So again, on the right is, it begins and ends with the spinal cord and brain. That's the central nervous system. That's it. That's all she wrote, brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is split into two, the somatic nervous system, which is sensory input and motor output to the skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, arousing fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic, calming rest and digest system. When we, before we leave today, or for this lecture, I wanted to put some of this information together to basically show you how it works. And I know that the book uses putting your finger over a candle to see if it burns, but I like using the example of touching a hot pot on a stove, right? When you do that, and I'm sure we've all done this, you touch the pot and then, ouch, your hand hurts. But what you may or may not have realized is that sometimes you move your hand away first, and then about maybe a half a second to a second later, then you feel the pain. And I don't know if anybody's ever wondered why this is. Well, let me show you. In this simple hand withdrawal reflex, whether it's your finger over a candle or your hand touching fingers touching a hot pot on a stove that you didn't realize was so hot, information is carried from your muscle, from your fingers, up, as you can see in this red pathway here, going up towards the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord, information goes to the brain. Well, in red is the sensory neuron that's going up towards the brain. In blue, coming back down from the spinal cord, is the motor neuron that's telling your finger what to do. Whoops. How do we get all the, it went ahead one, sorry. So what happens is, because information about the muscle does not need to go up to the brain, we can see that the sensory information is connected to the motor system with this interneuron. So you only need to go to the level of the spinal cord for you to move your fingers. You don't necessarily need the brain for that. So it's a reflex action. So information is carried from skin receptors along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. From there, The interneuron gives the information to the motor neuron, so really quickly at the level of the spinal cord, you can move your finger or move your hand away from the hot pot. But pain is actually part of the touch system, and that has to go all the way to the brain. So although you can start the reflex withdrawal at the spinal cord, the pain itself has to go all the way up to the brain to be interpreted. And because of this, it takes about a half a second or a second to actually feel the pain, even though you've already moved your hand. That is the reflex system. So we're going to end there today, or now. And when we come back for the second part of this lecture, we'll talk about the endocrine system and how it is a separate set of chemicals from the nervous system, and yet it's still controlled by the brain, because I promised everything we do is controlled by the brain. We will also talk about the parts of the brain and look at animal models of behavior, and I can answer the question for you, does looking at the behavior of an animal actually give us a lot of information to go on? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes, but I will talk to you guys next time. You will hear from me very soon. Have a good one.